The Jim Crow laws were laws that were passed during the 1800s by the state legislature in the southern United States. The laws discriminated against African Americans in the South. The laws were named Jim Crow after the minstrel show character. The minstrel show was one of the first American forms of entertainment. It started in February of 1843 when a group of 4 white men who called themselves Virginia minstrels started a show where they smeared their faces with black paint and danced and sang like African Americans. They soon became popular and were invited to perform around the country. The most famous performer among the 4 men was Daddy Rice. He was a white actor who was influenced by an elderly African American man from Kentucky who always danced and sang to a song that had the same chorus.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about I jump Jim Crow.
That is how the Jim Crow laws got their name. Shortly after the Civil War, the first Jim Crow laws were passed. There were many factors behind the Jim Crow laws. One reason was that white people thought of themselves as the superior race and thought that they were much more intelligent than African Americans. They also feared black domination, and as a result, whites limited African American political involvement, economic opportunities, and controlled their public lives. Segregation existed even before the Civil War. But the real Jim Crow laws were first enforced 33 years later. Whites underestimated blacks in many ways for almost 100 years without realizing the extent to which they did so.
Some examples of Jim Crow laws include: it shall be unlawful for a black and white person to play together or in company with each other in any games of cards or dice, dominoes or checkers. Birmingham, Alabama, 1930. Marriage avoid when one part is a white person and others is a bastard of one or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood. Nebraska, 1911. Separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school or any white child to attend a colored school. Missouri, 1929.
The Brown versus Board of Education decision said that separate was inherently unequal, and you can see that if you see photographs, for example, of the white drinking fountain and the colored drinking fountain. They're not equal. The facilities for African Americans were inferior, certainly in education, and that might be the most horrible legacy of Jim Crow, is that the African American schools were underfunded compared to the white schools in the South. They didn't have the same resources. They didn't have the same quality of teachers.
Oftentimes, the white people had buses to go to narrower and more privileged schools, while African Americans had to walk to older, more run-down schools. On February 1, 1960, 4 African American students went to Woolworth Lodge County in North Carolina. They boldly asked to be served, but they were refused their service. They said that it was against their policy to serve black people and were asked to leave.
There were many turning points in the history of Southern segregation and the Jim Crow laws. One of those turning points is the Brown versus Board of Education case. Brown v. Board of Education was filed in February 1951. This case proved that there were negative psychological effects in children who went to segregated schools. The Brown v. Board of Education's case ended segregation in public schools in the southern United States. It was a case that had brought hope and courage to African American youth.
I guess that when I think of the biggest single turning point, my mind goes to the landmark 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, because it was a unanimous decision by the United States Supreme Court, and it overturned Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896, which was a notorious decision.
Another turning point of the Jim Crow laws was the Act of the Freedom Riders. In 1961, the Freedom Riders, a group of civil rights activists, boarded buses and headed south to protest the racial segregation of the Deep South. It was a moral moment, a clear moral moment, but it was that moment for a lot of other people, and not everybody responded in the same way. So I feel privileged to have been a part of this, and I am proud of my role in it, said Albert Gordon, one of the Freedom Riders. The riders crossed many cities in Georgia without a problem, but faced a lot of problems in Alabama and Mississippi. The politicians opposing the Freedom Riders attacked the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders risked their lives in order to fight for equal rights for all minorities. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave rights to blacks to be treated equally as whites in public places. President Johnson, who did not favor the Civil Rights Act, was influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. after he gave his I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creeds. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech meant to bring peace and racial harmony. More than 250,000 people came to listen to his speech in Washington, D.C. About 75,000 of those people were white. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that eliminated the so-called literacy tests. These tests were made to make it especially difficult for African American citizens to vote. Although the end of Jim Crow laws positively affected black people in the South and throughout the United States, the existence of these laws still has a negative impact, as we still see de facto segregation in the U.S. today.